reading will be from Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade the Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood is on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, a leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in the city." And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
So a few of us started reading a book this week called Rejoice and Tremble, which is a study on the fear of God in Scripture, and it's a fascinating one. But in the opening chapter, there is this example, this thinking about our culture today. He wrote about what several have called the paradox of a safe society. The truth is we live in a safe world, and relatively speaking, if you think about history. I mean, you think about the sports we play, the gear that we have. I mean, I see Major League Baseball players going up with like full body armor in order to stand there and get for those pitches. A little different than like the old Bob Gibson era where like he would use that bean to the head just to give him a wake-up call. But you know, the sports that we play, the seat belts that we have in our cars, the way the cars are designed, all of the safety features around them, the medicines we have access to, the medical treatment we have access to. From a historical perspective, we live in a remarkably safe world. And yet, the paradox that scholars study is, why is it that one of the hallmarks of our age and our culture is worry? Why are we such a worried people? They have often found that as the society has gotten safer, it is something about that has made us more worried, more skittish, more panicked. One answer from a non-Christian scholar trying to understand it, he wrote about, it's moral confusion. The reason why we are so scared is that we live in a morally confused society. And the moral confusion of our society leads us to an inability to deal with fear, to an inability to deal with the rise in anxiety. And so it leads us to increase all of the protective fences that we have in our lives. This author that we're working through in the book says that you need to go one step further than that. It's not just the loss of morality or moral confusion, it's the loss of faith in God. And actually what underlies all of this fear in our culture is an inability to contend with our own faith or lack of faith in who God is. It's a compelling argument. I'm curious to see how he takes it, but I think it's a worthy question to ask here in Acts chapter 18. How does a belief in the God of the Bible help us navigate our anxious world? We live in a world with insecurities and challenges. We live in a world that can induce fear and anxiety. How can faith in God help us to navigate that? If you don't have your Bibles open to Acts 18, I'd encourage you to do so. Acts 18 is really becomes a kind of reflection, I think, for us as we think about Paul late in this second missionary journey in the ministry that he's engaged in. I think it is an opportunity for us to reflect on our own life in ministry and how we can navigate a world of uncertainty and do so in faith. the language that I want us to drive us as we think through this journey with Paul in Corinth is the language of ministry. One of the great lessons that emerged out of the Protestant Reformation was the reminder that we as Christians, all of us, are a priesthood. We are a priesthood of all believers, is the phrase that the Reformers would use. Another way to say that is we are all, each one of us, as Christians, called as ministers. We are called to minister, to serve. And thus we need to understand how our lives are to be oriented around that calling. And I think Acts 18 helps us in that. So you open up Acts 18, I think the first thing you see is a picture of a strategic ministry. And I think that's the first piece I want you to dwell on in the first 5 verses, is how ours, as Paul's was, is a strategic ministry. A few things that happen. First, you get introduced to partnership. Opening verses, Paul is leaving Athens. He goes to Corinth, and he finds there a Jew named Aquila, native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. We get introduced to Priscilla and Aquila. Now, this is the first introduction is Aquila and Priscilla, and eventually most of the references we're going to see to them will be the opposite. He has a partnership, and they forge this partnership. Actually, a couple of things that are interesting about it. How does he get to know them? He gets to know them because they happen to wind up there in Corinth because they've left Rome. And that little side detail becomes one of those key points in Acts. We've had a few of them already. I've tried to mention them when they show up. One of the key points in Acts that lets us date Acts, like the events of Acts, with some degree of certainty. So they've been driven out of Rome because the Jews were driven out of Rome. There were 2 times in this period where there was some kind of hardship on the Jews in Rome, but only one of them actually resulted in the Jews actually being kicked out of the city, and that was in AD 49. What's interesting about that moment in time is the reason why they were kicked out. One historian wrote this. He said that they were kicked out because they were, quote, indulging in constant riots at the instigation of Chrestus. This reference to Chrestus is an interesting one. Most think that is either a misspelling or a Latin derivation of the word Christ. And so it is suggestive that what's going on in Rome in AD 49 is a tension between Jews and Jewish Christians, and that tension has resulted in rioting from Jews, attacking on Jews. So there is this tension that you've seen laid out here in these last few chapters. It's the same kind of thing Paul is getting. So it would suggest that is a reference to Christian tension that drives them out. It also is suggestive of the fact that when they arrive, it is possible they're already Christian. They left because they were Christians. So much like Paul, they have been driven out of town because of persecution. It's a really interesting thing to ponder about for a lot of different reasons. Rome is, it's the center of the world, most important city of the world at the time. But 49 AD is before Paul has shown up there. It's before Peter has shown up there. And really, nobody knows how the Roman church began. How did the church come to Rome? They don't know. Nobody knows. There wasn't some big famous apostle that went there and started the church. The one reference we have is all the way back in Acts 2, in the reference to Pentecost. There is a reference there to people from Rome who are gathered there at the day of Pentecost. Is it possible that some were converted, some of that 3,000 that were baptized, took that message back to Rome and started the church in Rome? It's a really interesting thing to ponder about. What's useful to us is here Priscilla and Aquila wind up here in Corinth, and they forge this partnership. How do they forge this partnership? Well, they happen to share the same job. And here becomes an interesting point when you get to verse 3. It's a chance to really think about work. It's actually builds on a conversation we're having in our class this morning in Ecclesiastes, that there is a bigger vision of our sense of vocation. What are we called to do in life? Because here in verse 3, you get the reference to Paul working as a tent maker. Or you could also think of him as a leather worker. And actually a lot of times the job tent maker and leather worker were considered the same job. He went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Now, we don't have other references earlier to Paul doing this. So what is this? What is Paul doing here? He's trained as a leather worker, as a tent maker, and that's not unusual to think about. Paul if he was trained as a rabbi, the Jewish people actually, interesting between Jews and Rome and the Romans, the Jews had a much higher view of like blue collar labor, like working with your hands. They actually had a very high view of it. And in fact, rabbis were often said they were not supposed to be profiting from their teaching, and they were supposed to not be idle. So they were calling them to work with their hands. A lot of them would have other jobs that they would do, and then they were essentially like bivocational ministers, where they're working a job as well as doing their ministry. That was a normal thing in the Jewish world. The Romans had a more complicated relationship with this kind of work. Some would look down on it, some did not. But Paul does not seem to do this kind of work every place that he goes, which makes sense because a lot of places that he goes, he doesn't show up for very long. So there are times that he is supported in his ministry. There are times that people are funding the work that he's doing. They're making sure he's got a place to stay and he's got food. There are times, like here, where he is supporting himself. Now, if you read his letters, what you can glean from that is that itself was a strategic choice on his part. At times, he could see himself in a place where to receive their support would actually be destructive. It would create a kind of patronage relationship so that he would be obligated to them. And as the one bringing the word of God to them, there's a certain amount of independence that he needs to be able to say, this is what the word says, and your money can't control me. It can't make me say something otherwise. But here in Corinth, he settles in and apparently takes up this work for the duration that he's there. Now, what is it about Corinth that would make that interesting? Well, I think the answer to that comes in this larger question of why Corinth would be a place that ultimately, as we're going to see here, God is going to have Paul stay for a year and a half, which is very unusual in the ministry that we've been seeing so far. Corinth was called by one scholar, it was called the Las Vegas of the first century. That maybe captures an image of what it's about. It was a commercial center. It was a trade center. It was a key center of both a north and southern route and a east-west route. I think it had ports on both sides. So it drew this international audience. People are coming through there all the time. It was also known for its loose morals. There was a lot of different reasons why there were loose morals in the city, including some of the idol worship they would have. A big issue that Paul deals with in his letters to the Corinthians as he's dealing with a church that is struggling with that, knowing how to live in this kind of Las Vegas type environment. So it's a strategic place, a place where he could proclaim the gospel. And much like Acts 2, you think about people from Rome then heading back and sharing the gospel. As he sees people come to Christ, it's not just the people of Corinth that are being blessed, but he can see that ministry spreading. So taking on this job gives him a means of support. And I think the key for him here, what it does is I think it casts a vision for us in getting a bigger vision of our sense of vocation. What is a vocation? Well, vocation isn't just the thing that you do that draws a paycheck. The vocation is that larger vision of what you're about as a follower of Christ. And that sense of vocation may include, it is going to include somewhere in your family structure some kind of means of support, but it is also going to include the sense of your ministry to your family, to your neighborhood, to your church family, to the people that you're impacting. There's a larger sense of who you are and what you are about. And in that sense of vocation, some means of financial support becomes a piece of the larger puzzle. And so for Paul, at times, that leads him to what we would call today a bivocational ministry. Really, some of my heroes in the faith are those who labor in bivocational ministry, those who are taking jobs during the week in order to take that burden off a church that they're planting or a work that they're trying to help establish so that they can be faithful in that ministry without having to worry about that means of support. It's a beautiful picture. But what it's a model of for us in all the different things that each of us do, it reminds us that we're to see our whole life, all that we do related to our calling as the people of God. Everything that I do, the job that I have, the money I make, the relationships I have, the time that I spend, who I'm trying to befriend, who I'm trying to reach out to, who I'm engaging, all of this is a piece of this whole life of the vocation. And that language of vocation that I'm trying to use it really, frankly, the way the reformers used it. We've often diminished that word and think just about the job that you do that draws a paycheck. That sense of vocation biblically is much bigger. Paul is modeling that for us here. And so he does that work, but the focus is not on him tent making. Verse 4, what is he doing? He's doing the same kind of thing he's been doing over the last few chapters. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. This is a ministry of persuasion. That language is something we've been seeing over the last few weeks throughout this ministry. We saw it a lot in Athens last week. You notice it is a persistent ministry. Here he is showing up Sabbath after Sabbath. We don't know how long that is, that he's reasoning with them. He's trying to help them see the power, help them see the reality of who Jesus is and why he matters, why it changes how they should live. That ministry actually changes. Verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word. Suggesting that maybe at that point they're actually coming with support so that he's no longer in the tent-making role, that he can come in and out of that job as he receives support. It was important here for reasons I think actually you get a little bit of in Corinthians, the letters to the Corinthians. It's important for this church that he not take support from them, but here another church can come and give him support so that he can do this ministry. But as he's occupied with the word, what is he doing? He is testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus, that the Messiah was Jesus. It is a work of persuasion and testimony, and that's, I think, a reminder of what we're to be doing. His was a kind of faithful presence as he is showing up week after week with a ministry of persuasion. This is who God is. This is what God has done. He's continuing to persuade. He's continuing to testify to the big barrier, the thing that the Jews need to hear. The Greeks need to hear it too, but in a probably different kind of language. They need to hear that this Messiah that they've been expecting for all these years has shown up now, and his name is Jesus. They need to know that the Christ, that the Messiah was Jesus. All of this models for us a strategic ministry where Paul is seeing his whole life submitted over, all of his time and resources, energy, designed so that he can serve God in whatever way that God calls him to do. That's a strategic ministry. It is also a ministry that comes in and out of season. And this is a thing that I think we have seen. It is reinforcing what we have seen in the last few chapters. A feature of his second missionary journey is that he gets opposition. So what happens? Verse 6, when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." He receives this opposition, and it leads him to do this interesting act of shaking out his garments. What I want you to see there is how the messenger and the recipient have different responsibilities. That opposition is not light. When it says there that they opposed and reviled him, one of the words there is the word for that would be used for blaspheming. We've seen that actually already in some of the opposition Paul has. So they're blaspheming him, which is a vivid picture of the depth of their opposition to him. So he's been persuading them for a while. He's working on it, and for some it's just not working. And the level of hostility, it's not just a disagreement anymore. Now it's got some kind of vigor to it, to the point that he is shaking his garments out. Now when he shakes his garments out, it's an image of judgment. It's somewhat akin to, actually Jesus would instruct them, his apostles, when you go to town, if they say no, you shake the dust off your feet. It was a prophetic act, a symbolic act of moving on. I've given the message, you've rejected it, shake the dust, and you just go on to another place. The shaking of the garment, a lot of folks study that and try to figure out what that exactly means. It's similar, and maybe the only difference is the reason why it's the garment and not the feet is because he's not leaving. It's not that he's abandoning Corinth, but he is giving this sense of judgment upon them. He is confirming for them, really in various echoes of some of the prophets in the Old Testament. He's confirming that he has fulfilled his responsibilities. His responsibility was a ministry of faithful proclamation. And as he gets this opposition, he can stand before them and say, I have been faithful. I have given you the message that I was given. I have passed it on to you. And that's why he can say, a vivid picture, your blood be on your own heads. That is the image of a prophetic message that has been faithfully delivered. Which means, for the prophet, the responsibility is off his shoulders. I've done what I was called to do. Now the responsibility is on your shoulders to hear the word of the Lord and respond. And so he can essentially wash his hands and say, I don't bear any responsibility for what happens. I'm moving on. And he says, from now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. And he leaves. What's funny to me is notice where he leaves. Verse 7, he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. So he has this big symbolic departure, and he walks like 5 feet over and knocks on the door, and like that's where he's at, which I think tells you something of his heart. This is the thing we've seen throughout, that he goes to the Jews first, and when they don't say anything, then he's going to go and focus on the Gentiles. But even where he focuses on the Gentiles, his heart is never very far away. He still has this desire to convert. But what it means is that he's at that point then working outside of the synagogue. In fact, you're going to see, even in this chapter, images of descriptions of conversions of Jews from within the synagogue. So it's not like he's saying, I'm not going to speak to any Jew anymore, I'm done with you. But he is done with the synagogue. And as he's gotten that hostility, he steps out and he's going to do some kind of different work. But he is willing to separate that. And I think if you're thinking about your ministry of faithfulness, your ministry of faithful presence, you're going to be encountering and working with folks and try to desire something for them. You're going to have a person that you're burdened to pray for as they struggle in life. And you're going to have a person that you're struggling with to share the gospel with, or just to see like there's this thing that they can't hook, that the gospel means that this piece of their life should be different, and they just can't. And you're going to struggle with that. If you've got a heart for that person, that's the stuff that'll keep you up at night. And here, I think there's an encouragement here that you see Paul, as much as his heart ached and yearned to see the conversion of the Jewish nation, he also is willing to say there's a place where I end and they begin. And there's a place where they have to bear their responsibility. And I could say, I've been faithful. This is all I can do. And I think having that sense of boundary in your life to know that there is that place of separation, that you are not responsible for the decisions of other people, is a vital piece if you're going to have a sustainable ministry in your life, in season and out of season. And so he does that. He leaves, he goes next door, and then he gets a response. Verse 8, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. So there's this, even as he departs, and he got that opposition from the synagogue, he gets a response, and it's from nothing less than one of the heads of the synagogue. He gets this beautiful response that there is this affirmation of what he's doing. I think as a little side note there in verse 8, I think it's an important little side in terms of the larger argument from Acts. Notice what it says, that he believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And then the next sentence, he says, many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. So there is the overall picture. This is a celebration of the success of Paul's ministry right now. This is a ministry in season. Even as he faced hostility in the synagogue, leaving the synagogue did not inhibit his ministry. But as we talked a few weeks ago, one of the things that comes up in the book of Acts are what they call the household baptisms. And so it's considered, are people being baptized because they're part of a household where, the father comes in and says, I now believe, and they say, well, I don't know what you're talking about, but dad says to do it, so I'm going to do it. And we've built a lot of systems of theology over on that argument. And the argument I've made is that I don't think that's what happened. I think Luke actually, if you watch carefully the pattern of what Luke is describing, he is describing household conversions. He's describing times where people the Father comes in and testifies, and everyone says, I'm in. And that's exactly what he describes here. He's describing the faith of the household. He's not describing them being baptized, though you can imply that is. And in the next verse, he talks about this mass group of people being baptized, but all of those are people who are coming in faith. And all I think that does is help reinforce this notion that when Luke is talking about households when he speaks of households being baptized, it is implied that is households coming to faith. And I think there's really only one instance, but boy, it gets used to do a lot of damage in understanding what that means. But here, there is widespread acceptance among Gentiles, and yet we're going to see in verse 12 the beginning of some hostility. I'm going to talk about 12 through 17 in more detail in a minute, but just notice where you peek into that. Verse 12, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. So there is this hostility that actually sets us up for things we've already been seeing in these last few towns. Town to town, Paul is getting driven from these places because of the hostility. So the success is this ministry in season. And here, as we're getting ready to launch into, you're going to see a ministry out of season. That's a calling that is on our lives as believers, as we are called to be faithful when it's well received and when it's not. And I think we're living in an age where we have to be honest about that. I mean, it's a lot of folks debate the timetable, but there's a lot of folks in ministry will talk about it. The scholars that kind of look at the movement of the U.S. culture, they just talk about just a trajectory that we have lived in a season. Many of us, I think I was part of this too, that have lived in a time where Christianity and the church was widely considered in the U.S. to be a positive thing. People may be indifferent to it. They may not want anything to do with it, but you say, well, I'm sure glad there's a church around. I'm sure glad there's people that are Christians here. You know, it was viewed positively. There was a point at which, and people debate what year you really would see that, but that view became more of a neutral thing. Well, I don't know how I feel about those Christians, but here they are. Increasingly now, we are living in an age where Christianity is viewed in negative terms, more and more. And I think if you are in an academic world, I think if you're in a college scene right now, if you are if you're living in the Northeast, I think you get little glimpses of it in Chicago. You see more and more of a hostility to Christianity, and that just as a reminder, that's part of what it is to be faithful as his people, that sometimes people are going to like what you're doing, and sometimes they're not. And if as we as American Christians experience more hostility, I think we can learn a lot from the persecuted church around the world. There are a lot of folks who are worshiping this morning in a place where they are living under threat. The mere fact that they are gathering in worship will subject them to arrest. It subjects them to persecution. The mere fact, if they are known to be a Christian, it subjects them to the loss of a job. It subjects them to a different kind of track. The persecuted church around the world today can remind us of that there is a reality that sometimes that ministry that we'll have will be in season, sometimes it'll be out of season. Sometimes it'll be well received, sometimes it won't. But what Paul models for us is a faithfulness in all seasons. Now, in the midst of this, what happens? He's got this positive moment, verse 9, and then the Lord appears to him. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you or harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." Why would he tell him that when it's all good, right? Everyone's coming, people are coming in faith, and then he tells them, don't be afraid. He warns them, it's going to get ugly here. This is going to get rough. This vision is a picture of reassurance. It is a reminder of God's faithfulness in his ministry as God is faithful in our ministry. The bedrock that will sustain each of us as we live as the priesthood of all believers, as we live the ministry that God is calling each of us to have, is the reality that God is faithful. God's sovereign hand guides his people and provides the security that we need. Paul here is entering into a season of uncertainty, but it's an uncertainty that is only there for Paul. God is not surprised at what's getting ready to come. God is never at a point where he say, well, I did not expect that. That's not what God does. God knows, and God gives him this reassurance. Don't be afraid, but persist. Keep on doing what you're called to do, which is to speak and not be silent. He calls him to faithful proclamation and reassures him of his presence and actually of his protection. Why does he offer a reminder of his presence and a statement about a commitment to his protection? Because God's got a purpose there. And what does he say? It's a really unique phrase. I have many in this city who are my people. I think it's one of those phrases that's shown up several times in Acts that it just kind of helps us a little bit to think about what is this ministry doing. Paul is going out and faithfully proclaiming. He's out there doing the ministry of persuasion. He's trying to help people see who Jesus is. But God's somewhere behind this. And what he says, the way he says it there, is that God's got a people. And as Paul faithfully proclaims, some of those people out there are going to respond, because that's what God has determined, is that some will respond. God is going to build his church from every nation, tribe, and tongue. He's going to build his church, including some of these Corinthians. God has a purpose for that city. And so because he has a purpose for that city, he will provide what Paul needs to get his work done. And for now, what that means is that what Paul needs is he needs to be protected. He needs to be able to faithfully proclaim that. And he reassures him, you're going to stay. Paul's been in a pattern where he's been leaving. And there's never a judgment on that. This is not like God is saying, yeah, you've been kind of running too quickly. No. There were times that he left, and that's what God wanted him to do, was to leave. Now he's wanting him to stay. And because he wants him to stay, he said, you need to stay here. I'm going to protect you. You're going to have what you need. So God's purposes, he takes away the fear, emboldens him to stay, knowing that God's purposes will be accomplished. His purpose is to bring the gospel to the many in that city who are his people. He has a people he's going to draw out through that ministry that Paul is going to do. It is a reminder to him, and really a reminder to us, that God's purposes are the bedrock that all of us build our ministry on. What are we trying to accomplish? It's not something where any of us are trying to get reputation or become famous or well known. It's not our work, it's God's work. That we are seeking to be faithful to what he has set before us so that God can achieve his purposes. God's purposes will be accomplished. And what it leads to is an 18-month ministry in Corinth where God gets his way. God is faithful in his ministry. God is faithful in ours. And then he takes this interesting aside. It's an interesting little piece, because then what he wants to talk about is government. And what he wants us to hear here in 12 through 17 is how the government is itself another tool in the hand of God. What does it say? I read verse 12 already. So the Jews have made this, you have Gallios, proconsul of Achaia. The Jews make this united attack, and they bring him before this tribunal. And what do? Verse 13, he says, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourself. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. What a strange aside. What's going on there? Well, first idea is that he is showing us that government is a tool in the hand of God to accomplish his purposes. What's happening is that the Jews are trying to bring the sword of government to their fight against Paul. There's a lot of discussion about what the Jews are asking for. And in fact, some argue that there's kind of this ambiguity. What is he saying? This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Well, what law are we talking about? And it really could be ambiguous. He could be talking about Jewish law. So what they would be doing is they're charging Paul with blasphemy, you are violating Jewish law, you're violating the Bible, the Jewish Bible, and we need the Roman government to enforce that against him. So they would be asking a Roman governor to acknowledge Jewish law and Jewish theology and have Paul held accountable for that. Well, that's kind of ambiguous. That's actually kind of an odd thing to ask a Roman governor to decide. Or it could be saying that we are a protected people and the Jewish people are protected. He is violating our theology. He's saying something about our God that is not true. Therefore, Rome needs to protect us and hold him accountable. Well, that's an interesting thing, and actually it's really fascinating as some of the scholars are, legal scholars trying to say, well, what is he really asking? What are they really asking for there? And we're not actually really sure. And it may be that they're kind of doing a little bit of a dance here, that they actually have the thing they're trying to accomplish, and they're trying to get the Roman governor, they're trying to play it with language that the Roman governor would recognize. Now, we've seen this before, haven't we? Go all the way back to Luke, and you saw this with Pilate. This is the same kind of thing that the Sanhedrin was trying to do to try to get Jesus convicted when they don't have the authority to have him executed as the Jewish tribunal. They have to have the Romans order the execution. So there's this little dance. It's a dance that we've seen before. And here, Paul is protected. But how is Paul protected? It's such an odd little piece. It's verse 14. Paul's about to open his mouth. So it's like we're getting ready for another speech from Paul. Here's going to be his great defense. But nope, we're not going to get that speech now because Gallio won't even hear him. What does he say? If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But it's a matter of questions about words and names and your own law. See to yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. He throws it out on jurisdictional grounds. He goes all judge on him. He lawyers up and he says, well, there's a little procedure. We got a procedure and you didn't comply with the procedure. I'm not going to mess with this thing. He has no interest in the issue. He refuses to hear it, dismisses it on the jurisdictional ground. So is that a great affirmation? Luke is writing all of this to somebody in Rome. Is this a great affirmation from the Roman governor to say, well, we really think Christianity is a legitimate thing? No, not at all. He shows him being absolutely indifferent to the message there. Further, second idea is that God uses the tool of government when it does its job well, and it also uses it when it doesn't. Now you see him dismissing this on a jurisdictional ground. He cuts Paul off, won't even hear him. Then you start to see some subtle things. That phrase there, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, some have said that really stands out. And actually it's almost like a anti-Semitic kind of term. It's like he's kind of giving them a little bit of slap. In fact, Gallio here is actually a quite famous guy. They actually know quite a bit about him. And one thing he is well known for is his anti-Semitism. He did not like Jewish people. So here is an example of him. He may actually be doing something that he shouldn't be doing. And he's doing it because he just doesn't like these Jews, this air of anti-Semitism. Now that gets reinforced with this bizarre little ending to the story in verse 17. Because then they all see Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. Well, we just had another ruler that converted to faith. Why are the Jews seizing Sosthenes here? Well, one idea would be that because he became a Christian. And they're going to seize him, and they're beating him up right in front of these guys. And what does Gallio do? Just lets it go. This is not a positive view of the Roman government. This is not the Roman government practicing justice and keeping the peace and doing what it's meant to do. It's showing a system that is broken. And yet, that brokenness is used here to just give Paul the protection he needs so that God can keep advancing the kingdom through Paul's ministry. So there's this tension here that the text, that Luke is both celebrating Paul's protection as something that is given by God and acknowledging the injustice of a broken system. The same thing that Luke did back in Luke when he's describing the crucifixion of Jesus. He will assert quite boldly the key message of Luke is that you crucified him, and that was God's purpose. God had a plan. You're responsible for your injustice. You're responsible for the evil that you do, and guess what? God is still getting his way. So he's using here government when it's doing injustice, when it's broken. So what do you do with that? Well, let me suggest to you that here at the end of this, that it reminds us of our need in the midst of our ministry for a God-centered vision of public engagement. I think this moment here corrects two extremes, and I've seen both in the last few weeks. There's one extreme where you just live in this world where you're supposed to keep your faith and your politics separate, and you just assume that God is just absent from the public sphere. You just go out and just argue for whatever you want. You're going to do whatever you want in the world of politics. It's a dog-eat-dog world. We'll just kind of keep it separate. We're not going to talk about those things. faith and politics just don't mix. That's one answer. And there's another answer, which is that we have this temptation to baptize our political stances. And I've actually seen 4 examples of that in the last 2 weeks from both parties. And in all 4 examples, each person was using the language of the Christian faith in a way that was co-opting Christianity to assert their message. And in all 4 of those examples, in my mind, every stance that they were standing for was actually evil, was against God. But they were using that language of Christian theology and baptizing their political views to say the Christian view would agree with me on this point. And I think, for 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans talking, I don't think the Christian view should agree with any of them on those points. So what do you do when there's this temptation to just baptize? And it's easier for me to see when it's the other guy doing it, when it's the people that I disagree with. But I've also got to recognize it on my own side that the people are doing it on my camp too. So how do you navigate? Well, I think here there's a middle ground that we're being offered from Scripture, which is that Christians are to advocate for the public good and for a Christian vision of justice. And I think Luke is actually doing that right here as he's writing to this Theophilus, say, look, your system is broken. Look at the injustice in your own thing. Don't be too proud of this Roman system of government. Look at the injustice that it's doing. So Christians can advocate for the public good. At the same time, Christians can have a kind of healthy cynicism about power and power structures. And we can have a certain amount of realism about those who benefit from that power and the ways that it's all broken and can break us. And actually the model for us, if you want to locate a person in history that did this for us, it was Augustine of Hippo, who really brought cynicism into the Christian landscape to help us, because he was able to look at the Roman world and say, yeah, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And he could have a certain amount of cynicism even as he was advocating for a better thing. So there's something here, and I think as we're entering an election season, so the ads are going to be coming soon. I think it invites us to hold our partisan affiliations, our political judgments, maybe a little more loosely, so that we can hold fast to our identity as the followers of Christ. And it is our identity as followers of Christ that should shape us and allow us to call a spade when the other guy gets it wrong, but when our own people are getting it wrong as well. We need a God-centered vision of public engagement. So, in all of that, despite all of that brokenness, Paul is faithfully working for his 18 months. And I think that's where we need to end, is that the cure for our uncertain lives in an anxious world is a faithful ministry that is empowered and sustained by a sovereign God. The world is too big, too chaotic, and too powerful for us to control and to manage. But the truth is, and all of that can be anxiety producing, because that's where anxiety comes from, right? When you just realize something is out of your control, that you really would like to be under your control. But the truth is that God is bigger, God is more powerful than all of it. And he has called us as his people, as that priesthood of all believers, to orient our lives around him. Our work, our possessions, our relationships, our time, they're all his. And we will find our path forward as we entrust all of it to him to follow where he leads. Christian, you are a minister. So minister with courage and strength by doing it in the power and the strength of your sovereign Father. Let's pray. God, I thank you that we can trust your sovereign care. And I pray that as we trust your sovereign care, it will embolden us to live faithfully, to proclaim you faithfully in all that is before us and all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. If we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.
Jesus.